My name is Donald M. Ware. I was born in Richmond, Virginia, raised in Arlington. I attended Duke University. I got a first degree in mechanical engineer in 1957 and commissioned in the Air Force the same day through the ROTC program. I didn't know whether I wanted to be an engineer or an Air Force officer, so I took a one-year delayed active duty and went to North American Aviation for 10 months. Decided I'd rather fly the airplane instead of work on it. I was working on F-100 flight test program heat and vent system, and so I kind of lucked out when I got into pilot training because I put my name in the pot for 100s, and we only had 3 100 slots in the class, and I got one of them. So after 10 years of flying fighters, they were going to convert me to F-111. This pin, this rather strange pin that I wear, is probably describes one of the most important things going on this planet right now. I think these little guys are Zeta Reticulans that many of the abductees, UFO abductees, see in their secret nightlife, if you want to call it that. And I'm absolutely convinced from everything I've seen over the past 52 years that there's a long-term program to upgrade our biological computer. Anybody that knows anything about computers knows you have to upgrade your computer every now and then. I think we're getting a bigger hard drive, a faster chip, and a new USB port for telepathy. And let me show you what I think you get when you combine the genes of these two species. I think this is, although not named by Time magazine, but this is Homo Alterios Spacialis, higher human from space. And these are our offspring, our children that have to be hidden from us until the consciousness of our neighbors changes and was willing to accept them. This picture was shown to millions and millions of people on ABC. They didn't say anything about it, but they put this picture into the consciousness of Americans at least, and eventually the world, I think, one more time. You know, you have to be somebody special to get your face on the cover of Time magazine. This is a promo issue, 23 June 1997 for the Roswell 50th anniversary, Roswell crash 50th anniversary. Certainly there is a cover-up, and all UFO researchers recognize that Project Blue Book, the most public cover-up, was just the government's public relations agency. They did announce to the world they wanted to know about our UFO sightings and stuff, but the cases that were really worthwhile and could not be explained away by some natural or man-made object were not investigated by Blue Book. They were passed on to the real investigators. And I'm convinced that the Office of Naval Intelligence was the office of primary responsibility for ground, or you might say ground activities associated with the alien presence. And the reason is because their bases were in Navy territory, not in Air Force territory. Although we'd see them more in the air, these things could come and go from the air down through the water, no problem. You read books like Wendell Stevens' book, Contact from Undersea. It's a very interesting story. It was 1979 when Filiberto Cardenas was pulled up a blue beam in broad daylight with 3 of his friends, taken to a little island. This wall opens up, he gets into a little flying saucer, and he goes out over the water very fast down through the water. The water didn't touch the vehicle. Ended up in a garage down there where there were a bunch of flying saucers and stuff. And the head alien down there told him there were 700 working out of that base, and there are lots of other bases underground and undersea. That first time, I just saw red lights that were about as bright as Venus would be at its brightest, maybe a minus 4.5 magnitude. But they were wandering around in random motion, and obviously not aircraft or celestial objects. And my thought was, gee, is this what I read about last Sunday morning in the newspaper? Because the Washington Star had flying saucers in the headlines. And so nothing more was happening. So I, after about 10 minutes of watching them, so I went on to bed. It was, pushing midnight by then. I got up early the next morning to get the newspaper, and sure enough, again, second Sunday morning in a row, the word flying saucers was in the headlines. The aliens put on a demonstration to the extent that the media could not ignore it and the government couldn't cover it up. Let me get back to that earlier question. Can you imagine any president, whether it be Bush or Clinton or whatever, standing before the public and saying, yes, I am aware that we have this joint program with some aliens to upgrade our biological computers, to build better bodies to house our souls in future incarnations. And we are picking up your daughters and your wives, and we're taking their eggs, we're splicing in the right genes. Some are subspecies that look more like us, and their human mothers are allowed to raise them, but those that don't look enough like us to fit in with our society are taken at 3 to 3.5 months. They're about that long. We put them in artificial wombs. Then we pick up the mothers again, and we take them in and allow them to hold them within their aura to nurture them. We pick up the grandmothers sometimes for the same purpose. He says, they can't talk about things like that. If any president made that kind of statement, then, because they pick them up and they have to put the altered egg in there, and then they pick them up again, he wouldn't be able to do the job we hired him to do. The media would hound him to death. It'd be ridiculous. So I understand the reasons for the secrecy. I spent 26 years in the Air Force, and I know if the government has a secret they really want to keep, they don't admit they have a secret. Okay, I was fortunate I had a chance to talk to Peter Jennings for his ABC special, and the first question he asked me was, what caused you to be interested in this subject? When I was 16 years old, I was walking down the street in Arlington, Virginia, and saw 7 red light type UFOs over Washington that made headlines around the world. And since then, I have seen 8 alien vehicles on 8 occasions. It was just that 3 seconds, alien vehicles on 8 occasions, that got on the ABC special. But that started me to become a truth seeker on 26 July 1952. I've read everything I could find about UFOs and the alien presence since then. At 17, I went to Duke, read everything in their library on the subject. American Rocket Society had the most interesting stuff. Went to the Air Force, 26 years as a fighter pilot, staff scientist, teacher, program manager, got a master's in nuclear engineering, retired at age 47 with 100% of my time to do whatever I wanted to do and enough money to do it. So the day after I retired officially, I became a field investigator and state section director for MUFON for 5 counties in western Florida. The next year became state director for Florida. In '89, I was elected to be the Eastern Regional Director of MUFON, overseeing the investigative activities in 18 eastern states. In '93, I became a director of the International UFO Congress. Since '82, I have been attending 6 conferences a year on the average, of many different types that involved expanding consciousness and UFOs. Things like International Transpersonal Association conferences in Killarney, Ireland, and Noetic Sciences conferences, international conferences on science and consciousness. And I heard about these things called State of the World forums that were put on by a fellow named Jim Garrison with the State of the World Forum, who's also president of the Gorbachev Foundation USA. And all the world leaders were coming and basically trying to figure out what kind of a planet we want to live on in this 21st century. And I never got an invitation. You had to get an invitation to that real select group. I was on a birding trip in Attu Island because I'm a serious birder. And I was discussing government affairs in the evening hours when we weren't out birding with a gentleman from Point Reyes who was also interested in government affairs. And I told him about State of the World Forums, and he had never heard of them. It was some miracle, I think, that caused an invitation for him to attend the State of the World Forum, the sixth and last one, held in New York City in conjunction with the UN Millennium Summit, to be in his mailbox. And he didn't want to go, and he knew I did, and he just put it in the mail and said, "Why don't you go in my stead?" So when the package got there, you filled out the registration form, and there's a place for title, and I put Director, International UFO Congress. When I got there, I was quite impressed. There were about 1,500 people trying to figure out the best ways to manage globalization so that the selfish didn't gobble up the meek and destroy the environment that supports us all. I got to participate in roundtables on democratizing world government, on getting more spirituality in the United Nations and that kind of thing. I actually, when it came my turn to talk in that World Governance Conference, I suggested that people trying to decide how to get from where we are to a democratically elected world government ought to read 3 books. And I mentioned Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret, because it describes 1 or 2 major UFO cases in many different countries and how that government reacted to it. And I said they should read Bud Hopkins' book, Witnessed, because this is a very good description of not UFOs coming here and saying, take me to your leader, but UFOs coming here and taking the Secretary General of the United Nations and putting a guilt trip on him for humanity polluting the oceans. And the 3rd book was called, was actually paper 72 in the book called the Urantia book, A Revelation for Humanity, published in 1955 on 2,096 pages. And the title of the paper was Government on a Neighboring Planet. And it said at the end, the reason they gave us that was because there were ideas expressed there that would be useful on our planet at this time. Well, that conference, being an attendee, allowed me to put a web page on the exclusive State of the World Forum website, only accessible to those people that attended the 6 State of the World Forums, which include most of the heads of state. And it apparently got the attention of the president, because about a year later I received a phone call from his vice president saying, Jim Garrison would like to speak with you. And I said, it's going to have to be this afternoon or 3 weeks from now, because I'm going to Thailand. And 3 weeks, later, they called at the appointed time, and a lovely lady named Carmen Melendres said, well, unfortunately, Jim got called out this morning, and she talked to me for about an hour about all the wild things that the ideas I've acquired at all these conferences, and so I started, sending her emails and occasionally some of the papers that I had written over the many years, and she told me later that she was forwarding all these to Jim Garrison. And the paper's about telepathic communications and UFO phenomenon, and one was on transformation, spiritual, physical, and political, and I'd written papers on paths to world government. All the subjects related to the UFO phenomenon that I'd studied one at a time, and then I'd spoken on for a year, and then written a paper on. And he must have not been too disturbed by what I was saying, because he sent me an email invitation in, I think it was May of 2003, to be one of the 150 people invited to the Brussels conference, 18 to 20 June '93. The title of that conference was National Sovereignty and World Challenges, Choices for the World After Iraq. And I was to attend as a director of the International UFO Congress, which I thought was kind of interesting when you see the titles of all those other 150 participants. The conference was chaired by George Bethune, who from 1975 to 1992 was the European chairman of the Trilateral Commission. The speakers were people like Air Marshal Sir Timothy Garden, who was the head of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the kind of similar to our Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. And Pat Cox, the head of the European Parliament, I guess, just lots of other interesting people. The president of the International Chamber of Commerce, and James Woolsey, and really neat folks. So unfortunately, well, they were sending me background information that said, well, after World War I, we formed the League of Nations, and that to keep peace in the world, and that didn't work. So after World War II, we formed the United Nations, and that didn't work. Now that we've had the first two battles of World War III, meaning Afghanistan and Iraq, it's obvious the Security Council can't maintain peace in the world, and NATO can't even maintain peace in NATO. It's time for a change. And they were talking about something called Community of Nations. And I had a prior commitment on those dates that I just could not break. As much as I wanted to go to that conference, I told him, I'm sorry, I just can't break the commitment. And so he said, no problem. Why don't you make your input by email? So I did. And I felt honored when after the conference he sent me a draft of the output document and asked for my comment on the draft. The draft title was Integral Governance Initiative, and it outlined or described the 20 most important problems of the world. I think they decided they're so critical they don't have time to even rewrite the Charter of the United Nations to be able to effectively address those problems. So they're going to do it, one problem at a time with the same technique that they used on the landmine ban treaty. Lord Axworthy, the Foreign Minister of Canada, with backing of the Canadian government, in not more than about 2 years, got 140 nations to sign that treaty. So I'm excited about the works that State of the World Forum is now working on to address the problems of the world.
The aspects I'm going to add is the presidential involvement in the Roswell thing. And the first president I'm going to talk about is Harry Truman and his involvement. And I've spent a number of years trying to track where Truman was at the time, how he knew, all this sort of stuff. And very little, because the presidential records weren't kept the same as they are now. There's a lot of blank spots, a lot of stuff wasn't recorded. And it basically, when I came to this convention, I learned a lot of stuff that I really hadn't known yet about the timelines following the generals. And the one story I've sort of added, which is, I think, sort of a critical story, is the fact that there was a number of people, Roswell witnesses, who were claimed that they were sworn to secrecy by the president. So what I'd do with each of those, I'd take the name of the person and I would check it against the presidential record. And with the presidential record, if you've met with the president, if you've spoken with the president on the phone, or if you've corresponded with the president, that's all recorded. You can take your name and you can see how many times this person, and none of these people were really checking. Then what happened was a reporter out of Florida who does the UFO stories, Billy Cox, did a story about Ben Games. And Ben Games was a guy who had a PhD, was a major in the Air Force, very prominent type guy, had come forward and told him a story that he had flown in General Craigie, who was development of all the new aircraft in that time out of Wright-Patterson, and he's claimed that he had flown Craigie into Roswell at that particular time when this was going on, and that Craigie had got into one of Blanchard's cars and had taken off and said, "Make yourself scarce, I'm going to be busy," and really didn't tell him what was going on. So Games went to the officers' mess, heard the story of people telling about this crash that had just taken place and bodies and this sort of stuff. And so when Craigie comes back a number of hours later, he said, "Well, fly me to Bowling Air Force Base. He's going to meet with the president." And according to Games, Craigie never told him what had happened, what he had been involved with, but his boss was General LeMay. And there was always rumors that General LeMay actually maybe had been at Roswell, was very involved in this whole thing. So anyway, when I got this, then I was really curious. Like, all these people are being sworn to secrecy by the president, but the presidential record really didn't show any involvement by the president. They had shown that the president had been asked a UFO question, and there's only 2 presidents who have actually been asked a UFO question in a news conference, and one of them occurred 2 days after the Roswell news release on July the 10th. And the problem was they asked the wrong question. They asked him, "Have you got any insides?" And he said, "Only what I've read in the newspaper," and the press dropped it. So when I wanted to find out, so what I did is I contacted Tom Carey, who is one of the people on the latest Roswell book, and their research is just incredible. I saw their lecture yesterday, and only twice in 35 years have I ever had a feeling that this thing may actually break open, that this thing may, there may be enough evidence to actually end the cover-up. And yesterday I had that feeling. The other time I had that feeling was in 1978 when I saw Len Stringfield lecture in Dayton, Ohio, when the first mentions of dead alien bodies, when he started to talk about dead alien bodies. But very impressive. So I contacted Tom Carey and I said, "Well, there's these witnesses who are saying that the president swore them to secrecy, but I can't find any record in the presidential library that these people ever had any contact with the president." So Tom wrote me back and said, "Well, it wasn't the president, it was Secret Service that was swearing people to secrecy." So I said, "Well, have you got any names?" So he gave me 2 names, and I still remember I went, and I know how to check this, I went to the presidential records and I started to check, and I can still remember when I found it, and it was like the shivers went up my back. It was unbelievable. It was, the name they had given me was Gerald McCann, M-C-C-A-N-N. Gerald McCann had been swearing people to secrecy in Roswell at the time on behalf of the President of the United States. And sure enough, Gerald McCann was a Secret Service agent from 1944 till Truman left office. Now, to find out after that whether he was with Eisenhower, you'd have to go to Eisenhower, but it just was unbelievable. No witness would have been able to make up and guess a name like that. So that's one of the stories I'm telling here is this story, the Truman story, that you get even 60 years after, you can find a lot of material that really was never around that shows that we are on the right track, that this actually did happen. The second president I talk about when I'm here in connection with Roswell was Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was fascinated with the UFO subject. He had, that I documented, 2 UFO sightings. Ronald Reagan was the type of guy who liked, he was an actor. He knew where to stand. He knew how to do things with backdrops and stuff like this. And if you remember, he went to the Berlin Wall to make the speech. Gorbachev tear down this wall. And when he was president, he asked Steven Spielberg to come to the White House. And in the White House theater, they screened E.T. the Extraterrestrial. And one of the stories, and I checked this, I went to the library and got one photograph. They'd only released one photograph. During that screening, according to a producer by the name of Jamie Chandray, Steven Spielberg told him in Japan that near the end, Reagan had leaned over and said, "I bet you there aren't 6 people in this whole room know how true this whole thing is." And Spielberg was shocked. And since then, a number of people, Billy Cox, myself, numerous people have tried to contact Spielberg to get him to confirm this story. Did Reagan tell you this? And it's only in the last year that I've got a second confirmation from, and I haven't been told the name, but a major Hollywood producer who claims, yes, he saw my website, they went to it, and they said, yes, Steven Spielberg told me the same story. So anyway, Steven Spielberg shows this movie, E.T. the Extraterrestrial. This is in June of 1982. 3 months later, and you'll have to remember the Roswell book came out in 79, 80 by Moore and Berlitz. So the Roswell story was pretty popular back then. And here Ronald Reagan, 3 months after seeing E.T., suddenly appears at the Roswell airport and right in front of Hangar 84, he makes a speech. And he's speaking with Schmidt, who was the Harrison Schmidt, who was Apollo 17 astronaut, and he makes an ET joke. He makes a joke about ET at the beginning of the speech. And Colin Powell had numerous times told stories, and he had told to a presidential biographer that Reagan was always trying to talk about ETs in speeches, and his job as security advisor was to try to keep the stuff out of the speeches. And this is in writing where he said this. So Reagan makes this speech in front of the Hangar 84, and it's typical Reagan. He gets it out there and was fascinated. The third president I'm going to talk about here is the most, I think, the most important when it comes to Roswell, and that was Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton, if he had a meeting, a discussion with Paul Davids, the producer of Roswell, and Paul Davids, he told Paul Davids straight to his face, "I'm fascinated in this stuff." And his involvement was kind of lengthy. What had happened there was, at the beginning of his administration, he was interested, and I had given a lecture in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. And I had a woman come up to me at the end of the lecture, and it was one of these things where I said, "Can you promise to write me?" She was an older lady, very respectable older lady, and she said, "I can tell you why the Clintons are interested in UFOs." And I said, "Well, tell me." She says, "Well, my sister owns the famous restaurant that the Clintons hung out in." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, what happened was," and I'm not sure whether it was Bill and Hillary or somebody very close to Bill and Hillary, but when they were at the restaurant, they saw something. So Bill and Hillary had this interest in UFOs, and they got into the White House, and as the stories have been told, they got Webster Hubbell, who was worked with Hillary Clinton at the Rose Law Firm in Little Rock, and he said, "If I put you over there in justice," he made him Assistant Attorney General, he said, "If I put you over there in justice, I want you to do two things for me. Find out, number one, who killed JFK," because he was fascinated with JFK. He thought he was the second JFK. And he said, "Are there UFOs?" So he had this thing started where he was trying to get the information. I had one researcher told me that he would drag admirals into the room and say, "Tell me what you know about UFOs." And the admiral would sort of look at him like, "What planet are you from?" Like, "I don't know what's going on." And so Clinton was interested. And then what happened was Lawrence Rockefeller, who was a billionaire, and he was sort of the Rockefeller brother who was the humanitarian. He was the guy who was, he had a philosophy degree from Princeton, was very much into the ecology, he was into paranormal phenomena, this sort of stuff. And he decided whoever the next president's going to be, whether it's Bush or whether it's Clinton, he's going to go and get this guy to disclose. So when Clinton gets elected, Rockefeller makes his way to the White House, and as he told researchers like Bud Hopkins, he was just going to go tell the president. And Bud Hopkins says, "Well, that's not how it works. You can't just go and tell the president to disclose." And what happened was he was cut off at the pass by the science advisor. They stuck him with the science advisor, who was John Gibbons, Dr. John Gibbons. And so he went into John Gibbons. He says, "I think we need disclosure." And John Gibbons, because he's a big Democrat fundraiser, you know, he's got lots of money, you can't just sort of slough this guy off. So they said, "Okay, well, what do you want us to do?" And he said, "Well, it's a massive conspiracy, all this is going on, and you got to get to the bottom of this." And so Gibbons, and what happened was, during the Clinton administration, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is the office of the science advisor to the president. And because one other researcher had filed, Bruce Maccabee, and he'd gotten 500 pages. So I said, "Well, I'm doing the president, so I want to see these 500 pages. So when my request come back, I got 1,000 pages. And so this whole story of what is now called the Rockefeller Initiative is detailed in these 1,000 pages of documents. So and this story is told in the documents about Rockefeller coming in and describing the fact that it's a massive cover-up. And Gibbons writes back to him and talks to him and says, "Well, if the conspiracy is as deep as you say it is and as classified as you say it is, we'll have no chance to get to the bottom of this thing. What we should do is let's just take one case, let's get that case declassified, and then we'll go after the rest of it." And so Rockefeller, I guess, thinks about it and writes back and says, "Yeah, okay, we'll take Roswell." And that's why in the Clinton administration, when it first started, the Clintons put out the order, and a lot of people say it was the Air Force or it was through Schiff, but Clinton had a lot of power to greenlight this study. So the U.S. Air Force was told out to go and reinvestigate Roswell. So they start the investigation, and they go and they do their thing. And one of the things that Rockefeller had asked for was clearance for anybody who was going to talk, that they wouldn't be prosecuted. And there is, in 1994, there was actually a document put out which said that anybody, a witness from Roswell, could bypass their security clearances and could talk about it, and they wouldn't be prosecuted. So they get the report. A preliminary report for the Roswell study was put out in 1994. The final report was put out in late 1995. So the report comes back, and Clinton gets the report. Now, this we know by sort of putting pieces together. He goes to Belfast, Northern Ireland, and he makes a speech, and he's lighting the Christmas tree. This is November the 30th, 1995. And in this speech, there's a letter writing competition in Ireland for kids to write letters to the president. Now, the two kids who won the letter writing competition were sitting on the stage with Bill Clinton, but he didn't read their letter. He read a letter. And I went to the Clinton library when they released the files about 2 years ago, and I asked, where's this letter? And they can't find it, which makes me wonder whether the letter actually was made up by the president. And what is important to note is anything goes into a presidential speech is there for a reason. I've studied enough presidential speeches. I know every single word is checked. It goes, a State of the Union address will go through 30 different drafts. Every agency have to sign off on that presidential. So if it's in the speech, it's there for a reason. And if you see the actual clip when Clinton releases this, he's reading it very carefully. He's reading it from a script. He's not off the top of his head. And what happens was they don't read the letter from the two kids who won the letter writing competition who were sitting on the stage with Clinton. They read a letter from Ryan. And what Clinton says is, Ryan, if you're out there in the audience tonight, here's the answer to your question. No, as far as I know, a UFO did not crash in Roswell, New Mexico. But if they did recover bodies, they didn't tell me about it, and I want to know. Now, the reason he said that, and this clip came out and nobody really picked it up, was the first Roswell report released in 1995 didn't talk about the bodies, had no mention of the bodies. And what Clinton is doing is he's saying, I read the study, and you didn't talk about the bodies. You explained to me what happened, what's with the bodies. So the Air Force goes out and does a second Roswell report, and that's why there's two Roswell reports. So in 1997, they release a second Roswell report called Case Closed. And there's the one where they talk about dropping the dummies out of the plane, and the people misidentified, they got the date screwed up, and that's the explanation to the bodies. So this report goes back, and it sort of says to Clinton, here it is. Here's the answer to your question. Here's the answer to the bodies. And so Clinton sort of gives up on it, although Rockefeller does go to the Clintons, and he's sort of getting frustrated. He's going back and forth to the science advisor, and one of the interesting things to note is he's always got this letter that Rockefeller's drafting, and it's a letter on disclosure to the president. It basically outlines what he wants to get across. And a number of people helped him edit the letter. One was John Gibbons, who's a science advisor, and there's actually, in the presidential file, there's actually, you can see the handwritten notations from Gibbons on the columns, making recommendations, change this, do that, whatever. One of the people that he'd asked for to edit it was Billy Graham. And Billy Graham didn't really want to get involved because he said, I've got I've dealt with a lot of presidents, and I really don't want to, I agree with your issue, but I really don't want to get into it. But the other person who helped edit the letter, and we actually have a document that verifies this, was Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton looked over this document. So here's Hillary Clinton, the First Lady, editing a letter on UFO disclosure to the president. And Rockefeller's getting sort of very upset. Every time he wouldn't get what he wanted, he would say, okay, I think it's time to write the letter to the president. Then they'd go, oh, no, hang on. And they would do whatever he wanted to do. And so they tried to help him. So in 95, I guess Rockefeller gets upset. And he decides he's going to the president. He wants a meeting with the president. So the president goes to Rockefeller's ranch. And this is in 1995, before the 2006 campaign. And what happens is Clinton is seen as a sort of an elitist type guy. You know, he hangs out in Martha's Vineyard for his holidays and stuff like this. And so what they do is they agree to send him to the Rockefeller Ranch because it's backcountry, Wyoming, and he's going to go whitewater rafting and he's going to go camping. And Clinton said, like Dick Morris talks about, he hated it. He absolutely hated it. He didn't want to go there. He had no intention of camping and stuff like this. It just wasn't his lifestyle. But because they saw the swing voters in 1996 as being people who were techie people or people who were into the environment, he had to appeal to those people. Those would be the swing voters, and that's how he had to win the election. So they sent him there, and Rockefeller sits down with him. and he does a personal briefing. It's not a briefing, but it's a citizen, and he goes through a pile of material that was provided to him by Stephen Greer, documents and stuff like this. And Bill and Hillary both sit and listen to the whole thing. They really don't say anything. And then according to what Rockefeller told Whitley Strieber, the next morning Hillary came up and said, okay, we've listened to you, don't ever bring up the subject again. And so the subject sort of dies out there. But Clinton has talked about about Roswell a number of times, and a couple of times he's talked about it when the question really didn't have anything to do with UFOs. He was asked on a radio talk show out of Houston, and the more famous one is one that's just been put on the internet, and it's still not public. This was the one that we got Neil Gould, who out of Hong Kong. I've been trying to get this for a number of years. This. Conversation, or it was an answer to a question. He had been, I think it was to a bank. He had been giving a speech to a bank in Hong Kong, and he had answered this question about UFOs. And I had gone to the Clinton Library, and they'd sent me to the foundation, and the foundation really wasn't answering my letters, and I was trying to go. And so this thing is not public. It was sort of Neil Gould went, found somebody who was there, and they provided him a copy, but it's still not public. And in this, the guy asked him the question. I guess he must have been one of the powerful people who had set the thing up. And he said, well, as I have the position to do this, I'm going to ask you the question. And he said, do presidents actually pass secrets from one president to another, like you and Jimmy Carter, or you and Bush? Is there a set of secrets that get passed from one president to another? For example, where's Jimmy Hoffa's body, or what happened at Roswell? And Clinton starts laughing, and he starts talking about this. And he said, yes, I'll tell you. He said, do you remember Roswell? Do you remember the big anniversary that happened in he says 1998, but it was 1997. There's thousands of people from all over the world came there, and people were fascinated with this. And he says, I'll admit, I actually tried to look into this, and I tried to get the documents and stuff. And then he starts talking about Area 51. And he doesn't mention Area 51 because they're still not supposed to use the term. But what he said was, there's a lot of people in my administration who thought that Roswell was garbage, that it wasn't true. But a lot of them really believed that there was actually an alien and a spaceship at this military base in Nevada. And he's talking about Area 51. So he said, I actually sent someone there to check it out. And he said that we found out it was just a military establishment where they're doing top secret Air Force work. And then he goes again to talk about Roswell, that he really doesn't think Roswell happened. He thinks there's explanations for it. But on a couple other occasions, it still shows that he does know, and he's still very interested. For example, there's the famous story about Paul Davids. He's had a long involvement with Clinton. And Paul Davids' involvement was that his father was a professor at Georgetown University and taught Bill Clinton. So what happened in 1996, Paul Davids took all the Roswell material. He took his Roswell movie, and he took a bunch of different stuff, the Roswell book, and the first Roswell book, and he sent it to the president. And he said he got an overnight letter back from the president saying, thank you for the material. Didn't mention what the material was. Thank you, I really appreciated it. I liked your father, and this sort of stuff. So this goes. And then what happens is the Monica Lewinsky thing breaks out in late 96, 97 or whatever, and the FBI does a study. And the study, they do an investigation, and what they're doing is they're looking for a book called Vox. And this is the phone sex book that Monica Lewinsky had sent to the president. So they're looking for this book, and they go to and they get, I guess, a search to go into the president's personal library inside the Oval Office. And they pull all the books, and they put out the inventory of the books that were in the library. And they do find the Vox book. And the strange thing was, the book right next to the Vox book was UFO Crash at Roswell. So Clinton had it in his personal library. And then, so what happened was, Paul Davids, this is going back to just last year, Hillary Clinton's running for president, and the latest Roswell book by Carey and Schmidt is out. So he decides the president's got to read this book. I've got to him before, and he decides there's in the Hamptons, there's a fundraising breakfast for Hillary Clinton. And he decides, I'm going to this fundraiser, and I'm going to give this book to Clinton, and I'm going to talk to him about this. So he doesn't know whether the Secret Service are going to stop him at the door because he's carrying a package, of course, and security and stuff. And he said it was very strange. He walked right in, and he takes pictures of himself with Hillary in the background and to prove that he was actually there. And it was a $15 million estate. And Paul Davids, when he told me the story, and he's told it publicly, said that they told him, he said, I want to speak with Clinton. And they said, okay, here's what you do. Bill will speak first. Bill will stand up and talk. And once Bill's finished talking, Hillary's going to come up and talk. And as soon as Hillary's finished talking, Bill will be sitting at the back along these windows. Then you go and talk to Bill because everybody's going to be going after Hillary and asking her questions, and it'll be distracted. So that's exactly what he does. He waits, Hillary finishes, the applause starts, and he goes and he sits down beside Bill Clinton. And he pulls out the Roswell material. And he puts the Roswell book in front of Bill, and he says, here's and it had the cover up. And he said he can still remember Bill looking down at this Roswell book and looking at this subtitle about the cover up. And he just looked up and he said, you know, I'm fascinated in this stuff, and I'm going to read this. And so we know he was fascinated in it. He for whatever reason, and he green-lighted a number of studies. The other thing that he green-lighted that a lot of people don't know is his first CIA director was James Woolsey. And James Woolsey, and this is according to Stephen Greer, and we're trying to check this, but James Woolsey isn't talking anymore. He and his wife, who's a very high-ranking scientific person in Washington, in the late 1960s had a daylight UFO sighting in Maine. Was it Maine? It was on the East Coast there somewhere. And Stephen Greer had spent 3 hours with the CIA director at a dinner party and had been told this and this sort of stuff. And Stephen Greer is pressing the CIA director. Now, a lot of people say it wasn't a significant meeting, Greer distorted it, whatever. And I personally have requested, because we have a book, I personally requested interviews with these various people, and one of them was the CIA director. And I got a phone call back from somebody in the CIA office saying, well, very interesting project, we wish you well, but we're not going to do an interview. So I know anybody sits down with a CIA director for 3 hours, I don't care if you're talking about knitting or what you're talking about, if you sat with a CIA director for 3 hours, that's important. So the CIA director said to him, Greer said, we need this released. We need you to have disclosure. And Woolsey made a very important statement. He said, how can we disclose what we don't control? And so Woolsey puts out a request for a new CIA study. And this is Greer meets with him in December of 1993. And this study did come out. Now, Woolsey didn't stay around very long. I think he left in late 94, early 95. He was only there for a couple of years. He resigns, but this study does come out in 1997. And it's a study on a new UFO study by the CIA. And it talks about the 50 years of UFO investigations. And it's the one that comes out and says that most of the UFOs people are seeing were misidentifications of U2 or SR-71s and stuff like that. So they whitewashed the study. But it was a study that was initiated by James Woolsey. And I think Clinton as well greenlighted this, because there was a lot of different people in the Clinton administration who seemed to be involved and seemed to be sort of pushing different issues, and different things were coming out. And Clinton was very interested in openness. He did have a close association with John Podesta, who was his chief of staff. And under the Clinton administration, with John Podesta's help, they actually went into an openness thing where they said any UFO, not any UFO document, and the rumor was that they were trying to get the UFO documents, and by pushing all the documents out, the UFO documents would come out with it. And what they said, and this is an executive order in 1995 by Clinton, that basically said to the intelligence agencies that if the document is more than 25 years old, it has to be released, and unless you've got a really good reason. And the onus was on them, and that if there was a question as to whether they should release it or not release it, it should be released. The public should get the upper hand. So they disclose this, and what a lot of people don't know is that the Clinton administration declassified 800 million pages of files during their administration. So it's a situation, and the problem was that none of the UFO files came with it. There's a lot of stuff, and Clinton, one of the stories was that Clinton had tried to get it, and they hadn't got it, and one of the stories was that it was his psychological profile, that he had evaded the Vietnam War. He'd been going to school in Great Britain, and that he had the first issue he had when he got into the White House was to put gays in the military, which caused an insurrection in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And one of them actually spoke to him, and said that he totally disagreed with this. So Clinton was seen as sort of a left-wing guy that you really couldn't trust him, and that was always the story, that they wouldn't tell Clinton because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. And one of the things that Clinton did when these files were coming out is he actually did open his mouth about another incident, and that was the plutonium thing, where they were putting radioactive material in food and stuff like this. And this story sort of broke that the intelligence agencies had been doing this kind of stuff. So Clinton was the type of guy, he was very open. And even now, when people ask Bill Clinton the question about UFOs, he doesn't walk away from it. Most presidents, most high-ranking people will slough the question off. Bill Clinton will actually talk about it. But if you listen very closely to him, you get the idea that he's still really not telling the truth. For example, when he was in Hong Kong, part of the answer to his question was, the guy said, when he answered the question, the guy came back and said, well, is there a list or isn't there a list? And he said, well, if there was, I'm probably not the first president they lied to, or that bureaucrats have waited out. And he said, if there is some bureaucrat holding these files somewhere, they evaded me, and I'm almost embarrassed to say I tried to get to the bottom of it. So Clinton is an interesting guy, and I think if somebody respectable were to get Clinton and to actually confront him and do a half-hour interview, I think you'd get a lot of material, because Bill is pretty open. Even Larry King had stated, and this is 1994, and we haven't found out what the answer to it was. Larry King had a UFO sighting in 1972. He was working for the Minnesota, or the Miami Dolphins, had a UFO sighting, and he had been at Roswell in 1994, and or at Area 51 he was, and they were doing a show on Area 51. He did an interview with MUFON, and in that interview he had said, he told about his sighting, and then he also said that I'm friends with Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton doesn't like secrecy, and I'm going to ask Bill Clinton. But we've never been able to get to Larry King to ask him, did you ask Clinton, and what did Clinton tell you? So it's a very interesting presidency, and he's one of the guys that tried to get to the bottom and wasn't able to. The other one that tried to get to the bottom of the whole thing and wasn't able to was Jimmy Carter. Now, as you know, Jimmy Carter, his involvement came from the fact that he had a UFO sighting. And the date given was 1969, but I've talked to an archivist at the Carter Library who went to school with Jimmy Carter's son, and he said it was earlier. He said his son had told him the story, and he was sure it was earlier. Anyway, because he had this interest he had this sighting, in 1973, he actually filed a UFO form where he detailed what had happened, signed the form, and it went, I can't remember, it was a group out of Oklahoma that he filed with. So when it comes to him being president, he's running for president, and on two different occasions he talks about the fact that if he becomes president, he will release the UFO files. And so once he gets into the White House, and I went through his files, and a lot of people have been through his files to try to detail this, there are a number of initiatives that he does. For example, most people may not realize the FOIA material that we have, the UFO material, almost all of the material that we have was released under the Carter administration. The FBI files, the CIA files, the Defense Intelligence files, thousands and thousands of pages of files were released. And Jimmy Carter had the same sort of stance as Bill Clinton, that if there was a toss-up as to whether to release it, it should be released. So a lot of this material was released under him, and he sent a bunch of people to try to figure out what was going on. His press secretary, who was Jody Powell, went to the FBI and tried to find out from the FBI, how do you file UFO sightings, what do you have, all this sort of stuff. And the other one he went to NASA. And Frank Press, I think, was the science advisor, had gone to NASA, and they wanted a new investigation. They wanted NASA to take up a new investigation of UFOs, the same as Blue Book had done. And of course, what had happened, some of the background was that Carter had come in and he'd done some things he probably shouldn't have done. And one was he cut, I think, $5 billion from the NASA budget. So in one hand, he's cutting their budget, and the other hand, he's giving them this PR nightmare to take on the UFO thing, and NASA was very hesitant, but there was a lot of correspondence going back and forth about whether they were going to do this study. And then there was a document, a letter or whatever it was, came from the CIA to NASA, which basically said, do not touch it. Said, don't touch it. And then they called it off and went back to the president and said, no, NASA doesn't want to do the study. But Jimmy Carter had his problem, I think, was that he came in and, like Bill Clinton, he wasn't really interested in intelligence. And he fired a bunch of CIA people. And he was in a situation where he really wasn't trusted. And I think it's almost like Bill Clinton, there was a sort of a group that was always trying to get him out. And I even heard this when I went to the library, to the Carter Library. They told me the story that when Carter went in, and the same thing happened to Bill Clinton, they came from the South, and they ran as outsiders in Washington. So Jimmy Carter, for example, wore short sleeves when he was campaigning, which presidents never did. You always had your suit on. He'd take his suit off. He'd have short sleeves. He wanted to be the outside guy. He'd take his tie off. I'm one of you. I'm not a Washington insider, the same as Clinton had done. And so the problem was, and I've always said, if you're a Washington outsider and you win the election, don't be surprised if you go to Washington and you find out that the people who have the power, the money, and the knowledge don't talk to you. And that's what happened to Carter. And even the archivist told me that there was a lot of comments. It was sort of like, who does this guy think he is? These people walk around in bare feet and eat with their hands, referring to people that come from Georgia. And this guy's the president. And so there was this backlash. Plus, they would bring all their people in from Georgia in terms of Carter, and Clinton brought all his people in from Arkansas. So, and these Washington insiders really didn't like it. In fact, you probably recall when Bill got into a lot of trouble with the Monica Lewinsky thing, Hillary Clinton was walking around talking about the vast right-wing conspiracy that was trying to get rid of the president. And I remember at the time I sort of laughed about it, and then after I'm thinking, maybe she had something. Maybe she was talking about this inside group, these powerful people who were actually sabotaging the president on every initiative. So Carter had the problem the same as Bill Clinton, that he was a Washington outsider, and he really couldn't get to the bottom of the thing. And there's a number of stories about a briefing that he was given. There was was it a Secret Service agent? I think it was a Secret Service agent. There was a researcher who had been told the story by the Secret Service agent that Jimmy Carter had been briefed, and that Jimmy Carter was totally broken up by what he had heard in the briefing. And even one part that he'd been crying. And so I heard the tape, but this guy is still around, and he was actually appointed by Bush as a top person going into Iraq. So he was still a guy that was pretty powerful. They went back to him, and he denied the story. He said, no, he told stories about things that had happened, but no, that didn't happen. I wasn't in this briefing with Jimmy Carter. So it's always been very hard, because the records have always been kept very secret as to which presidents have been briefed and which presidents haven't. The only thing I know for sure, I can guess at a lot of stuff that Truman knew and that Eisenhower knew. The only thing I know, and I still haven't released the name of the guy, but I had a close friend who talked to me until I talked about this. And he said, can't keep your damn mouth shut. And I said, well, whatever, because it was supposed to be confidential, but people do in ufology, they'll send you stuff and then tell you not to keep it quiet. But it was an important thing, and that was that he had talked to 2 presidents. And he had come to me looking for Jimmy Carter's phone number. And he had already talked, and he was tracking, one of the big stories I've always tracked is the Holloman Air Force Base film. And the rumored story was, and this was part of the story that had been told about Jimmy Carter by this Secret Service agent, was that part of the briefing for Jimmy Carter was a 15-minute color film of the Holloman Air Force Base landing. And it was very important, and it seemed to back up the fact that this guy was telling the truth, even though he denied it later, because this friend of mine had told me that he was looking for Jimmy Carter's phone number. He'd already talked to Ford, and he had talked to Bush Sr. And they had both confirmed to him, he'd asked them about briefings, and they'd both confirmed to him that they'd seen the Holloman Air Force Base film. And the Holloman Air Force Base film is a story that Bob Emenegger, and I know Bob Emenegger very well, I've talked to him, been with him numerous times, heard the story 20 times, is a story that happened in the Nixon administration where they were green-lighted a study, and they were basically given access to everybody. Everybody talked, all the Blue Book people talked, and they were given a film, and they had it in their possession. They had this film, and it purported to be a landing. There was 3 crafts had come in. The film cameras were all set up at Holloman Air Force Base. They knew these things were coming in, and the one came down, the other 2 stayed up, and it landed on the tarmac, and a bunch of high-ranking officials came. These aliens came out of the spacecraft. This is all being filmed, and then they walked down the tarmac to a building on Mars Avenue at Holloman Air Force Base, and they had a meeting or whatever they did there. And so Bob Emenegger had this film, and these 2 presidents claimed to have seen this film, and this is what this fellow was actually researching. So he asked, for example, he asked Ford, and that's the key thing, is the briefing. He asked Ford, he said, well, when were you briefed? And Ford says, I'm not going to tell you, don't even go there, I'm not telling you where I was briefed. And that's the whole thing, is if you give the briefing date, then you've got something to work with. Then you know what room they're in, because the presidential record is all there. And you can tell who was in the room, you know who the people to press, and you can force the briefing out, but until you know when the briefing is. So it's always been hard to determine who got briefed and who didn't get briefed. Now, when it comes to Barack Obama has faced the UFO question on 3 different occasions. And the first occasion that Barack Obama faced the question was after one of Stephen Bassett's X-Files conferences. The Washington Post went to all the different campaigns when Barack Obama was campaigning and asked them, are you going to end the ET embargo on information? And Obama's spokesman said, we're more interested in ending the embargo on information coming out of Iraq. That was the first time. The second time was in October of 2007. Barack Obama was at a debate in Philadelphia. This is the famous one where Kucinich is asked the UFO question, and Kucinich confirms that yes, he did see a UFO at Shirley MacLaine's house, and it was a UFO, what's the big deal? The very next question, they go from him, asking the question of Kucinich, to Obama, and they ask him the question that all the astronauts of Apollo 11 all have said that they believe there's life outside of Earth. What's your position? And Barack Obama says, I really don't know, and I don't pretend to know. What I do know is there's life here on Earth, and we're not taking care of it. And then he goes into the whole speech about the people that have to be taken care of. So he avoids the question. Then he's asked, and we believe, we haven't tracked it down, we have the video, but we believe it's a Chicago reporter asks him the question, says, Mr. Obama, if you get to the White House and you discover that there are ETs and the people haven't been told, will you tell the people? And he says, well, it depends what the aliens are like, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. So he basically evaded it. And then I guess there's one other story. A lot of people, Stephen Bassett had done a campaign to send letters to the White House and a lot of different issues, and Barack Obama put up this change.gov site where people would ask questions and stuff. So there's a lot of people asking UFO questions. And they now have a website, the White House has a website where people can give their opinion on what they want. And so a lot of people are asking UFO questions. Now the woman that's running the website is Becky, I can't remember her last name, but is running the site, and she actually does describe the fact that people who are asking UFO questions or other questions can talk among each other, which kind of amazed me. It's like, the reason we're putting on it here is for you to read. We talk among each other all the time. You know, we don't need to talk among each other. And the one thing that she said was very discouraging, because the 2 big issues that have been brought up, people asking questions, are the legalization of marijuana, and the other one is, where's Barack Obama's birth certificate? So this woman, and she's out of the White House, said the most popular issues aren't potentially the most important, which basically says even if UFO people write millions of letters and it gets there, just because you have the most number of requests doesn't mean it's an important issue and we're going to answer it. So that's where it goes. Barack Obama is kind of a guy who's more interested in other stuff. There's the very interesting connection with John Podesta, who was the X-Files guy in the Clinton White House. And I know from people who've talked to John Podesta, and the main one being Leslie Kane, who says that she does not believe that John Podesta has brought it up and will not bring up the issue, that they've got other things to do. And so it sort of dies there, that you think, well, it's not an issue that they're really going to look at. And this comes to how I became involved in the president. I saw a number of UFOs. I was involved in a flap of UFO sightings in Carmen, Manitoba, Canada in 1975, 2 weeks after the end of the Vietnam War. I had my first sighting. This was near missile silos in North Dakota, the Minuteman III missile silos. And I had believed that the missile silos had been on alert because of the Vietnam War, and the UFOs suddenly appeared. Because I'd asked people in the town, like, why are they coming to our little town in Canada? It was in the middle of nowhere. And I'd had a number of sightings, and what I did was I wrote a manuscript called Tales of Charlie Red Star. And I'd put it out, and really the publishers, some of them read it. And I remember the local publisher, who should have done it, because it was a big story where I came from, said, you may believe in this kind of stuff, count me among the unbelievers. And that was my rejection letter to my manuscript. So I had the manuscript, and I said, well, this is something that I got to get, you know, I've seen it, I know what it is, and this is the sort of the title of James Fox's new movie, I Know What I Saw. And I've told people that 150 times over the last 35 years. I know what I saw. Don't argue with me about UFOs. I know what I saw. I was 50 feet away at one point of one of these objects. But anyway, so I knew what I saw, and I knew that it was probably extraterrestrial, that this was something. My father's a pilot, my son's a pilot. I'm not stupid. I know what I saw, and I wanted to get an answer to this thing. So when I got all these rejections on the manuscript, and everybody just sort of listened to my sightings and said, oh, it's kind of interesting, so what else is new? I decided to go after the Canadian government, and I went after the work of Wilbert B. Smith, who had run the Canadian government program from 1950 to 1954. I talked to him. I pulled all the documents from, and he had hidden the documents away. When before he died, he told his wife, hide the files, the government's coming. And the Russians came, the Americans came, and the Canadians came, all trying to get the documents, started breaking into the house. I recovered the documents, I found out where they were, filed the documents, and we came up with the famous document that David Rudiak could talk to you about. Top secret document, UFOs, or flying saucers. He never used the word UFOs. He knew it was a term developed by the US Air Force to throw people off. He always called them flying saucers. Flying saucers exist. It's 2 points higher than the hydrogen bomb in classification. It's the most highly classified subject in the United States. And there's a group headed by Vannevar Bush who's looking into it. And I went there and I found out that he was a contactee, that he actually claimed to be talking to them. We went through all this stuff. There was a bunch of other people that were involved in contacting them, and particularly a woman in Maine who had been contacted by the FBI, Navy intelligence, Air Force, White House. The same woman that he was using, and they all had contact with the alien by the name of Alpha. So anyway, I filed all that material, put it all sort of away, and it was very fascinating. A lot of people were very fascinated to find out the Canadian government was really into this and actually believed that this was going on, and that the guy in charge of it was actually claimed to be talking to them. And that material led to his correspondence, his meeting at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, where he got all this material. And the guy he got it from was Dr. Robert Sarbacher, who was a sort of a military advisor to the Pentagon. And years later, Stanton Friedman went back and found out this guy was still alive. This is in 1982, 1983. So Stanton talked to Sarbacher and said, did you give this material to Wilbur Smith? And Sarbacher says, yeah, I recall giving it to him. And so he said, well, why was it classified? I have no idea. He said, I have no idea why they classified it so high. And he said, well, how did you know about this? He said, well, there was a series of briefings at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Something had crashed in the West, and a bunch of scientists, and I was invited to go out there to briefings that they were giving to the top military people, or the scientists. They were basically scientists and engineers. And so Stanton says, well, name the guys who went. You didn't go, because he said he had been busy up in Canada working on the Dewline radar, and he couldn't go. But he said, well, who went? Who went? And he would name off Vannevar Bush, and he said, well, he's dead, and Bronk, and he would name all these different people. And Stanton says, well, can you name anybody who's still alive? And he says, well, there's this one guy from Pennsylvania. I don't remember his name, but he's real arrogant. He thought he knew everything. And a bunch of research was done, and they came up with a name of Dr. Eric Walker. Now, this material, it was my second book, which was published, the first book that MUFON published. And it didn't go anywhere because MUFON, it was an internal book. You couldn't buy it on the street. So MUFON published 1,000 copies. 1,000 copies were sold. It really didn't go anywhere. And what it basically is this guy, we tracked him down, and his name was Dr. Eric Walker. He was former president of Penn State University, the Ivy League Engineering College at State College, Pennsylvania. He'd been president there for 17 years. The president before him, who had given him the job as president, was Milton Eisenhower, who was the president's brother, who left State College, or Penn State, to go and work for the president, to advise the president, and Walker took over. And Walker knew everything, and he was the type of guy that when we phoned him, couldn't hang up the phone. So what we would do is, there was a bunch of researchers. I was sort of head of a team of researchers who contacted Walker from all over the world. And everybody'd say, I can get him to talk. And that wasn't my thing. So okay, fine. And I would get all the transcripts of people talking to him and send him letters and stuff. And Walker was the type of guy who wanted to sort of play with the subject. He didn't want to talk to you about it. And he couldn't hang up the phone. People would get him on the phone and he would try to talk around it. But when you put all these transcripts and all these letters together, you could actually determine what he was talking about. And a lot of times he did confirm. For example, we asked him about MJ12 and he confirmed, yes, I've known of them for 40 years. Look, you're up against the windmills. Leave it alone. There's nothing you can do about it. And that was like days after the MJ12 document came out. He basically confirmed, I've known of them for 40 years. That was 1987, and you take it back, it's 1947. So we put all this material in a book, and Walker was contacted by a reporter. We figured this was going to break the cover up, because it was so dramatic, this material, and this was such a highly respected guy. He had been actually an assistant secretary of defense at one point in the United States. So the reporter went, and for the first time, Walker hung up the phone. He said, I deny it, it's not true, and sorry, I'm busy, and hung up the phone. So I said to my co-author, who was a journalist there, I said, well, is she going back? What's going to happen? He said, no, she's not going back. And that was it. Nobody ever interviewed him again, and the story sort of died. So what happened then was, I was looking for his files. He was the the executive secretary of the Research and Development Board, which David Ridiak had been talking about. This is this top-level group that developed weapons in the United States, and he was the executive director. So when the director wasn't there, he was the head guy on developing weapons at the Pentagon. He was at the E-ring. He was in the major part of the main part of the Pentagon, and he had promised those files to the Truman Library. So that's how I got into the presidential thing. I was going after Walker's files. So I went to the Truman Library, and they didn't have the files. And so while I was there, I said, well, what have you got on UFOs? And they said, well, we've got a couple of documents, and they named a couple of pages, whatever. And I thought, this is kind of strange. You know, this is pretty important stuff. And about maybe 150 miles down the road is the Eisenhower Library in Kansas. So I was down there, and I'm a long way from anything. So I decided to go to the Eisenhower Library. And I went to the Eisenhower Library, and you actually have to do an interview to research there. So they were doing the interview with me about what you're going to research, whatever. And so went into UFOs, and they pulled the files, and there was 5 documents. There's 30 million pages of files and 5 documents. And at that point I said, this is the most important subject in the world. This is the most powerful guy in the world. The two have to go together. There has to be a connection. And I started at that point saying, what is the most important powerful guy in the world know about the most important subject? And that's what led me going from library to library to library. And what I basically found in a lot of cases is there's really nothing there, which either means nothing happened, or the president didn't know, or they're able to keep the files secret. They're there, but they're keeping them secret, which I don't think is one of the possibilities. Because over the years, as I've been to the Presidential Library, I've gotten to know a number of the archivists, and I don't think the archivists are covering the thing up. Because, for example, the one guy at the Carter Library had heard the Jimmy Carter story in 1967, was extremely interested. We sat in the archives 2 hours after the archives closed, talking about UFOs. So these people were very interested, and he would actually send me material that I hadn't even requested. He'd say, I found this, and he would send it to me. But the thing was that there's very little in the libraries, which leads to the question that Bill Clinton, I'm probably not the first president they lied to, or that bureaucrats have tried to keep in the dark, which leads to the thing, is there a second government? One of the main stories that's very interesting about the inner government is a story that Stephen Greer says that Sarah McClendon told him. And Sarah McClendon was a longtime White House reporter from the 1940s on, and she took Steve Bassett's, or not Steve Bassett, but Stephen Greer. She was close with him. She was trying to help him. And so she went to the president. She went to Clinton. She said, why don't you do what these people are asking? Why don't you disclose what's going on? And Sarah, and according to Sarah McClendon, Bill Clinton leaned over and said, Sarah, there's a government inside the government, and I don't control it. And that sort of fits in with what Hillary Clinton was saying. There's a vast right-wing conspiracy that's trying to get rid, that's giving Bill problems with all these scandals, and that's what's behind it. So there is this issue, and it is sort of supported in presidential files that either nothing happened, or the president doesn't know what's going on. Because in the presidential library, not only do you have millions of pages of files, you also have, the more important thing is the oral histories. And oral histories is things, something like what you're doing. They have a guy that's going to film or tape anybody that leaves the White House. You're the cook in the White House. Okay, what was it like to be the cook in the White House? Did you ever meet the president? Do you ever have, and go through this sort of stuff. And these people would just talk off the record about what it was like to work in the White House, what it was like to be Secretary of Defense. Oh, did they have this major event that happened to you? What was the inside story? And they would talk. And for example, at the Lyndon Johnson Library, there's 1,000 oral histories. And some of these, for example, at the Truman Library, you can actually word search them. And there's no discussion of UFOs. So you can cover up the records, you can cover up the documents, but can you cover up people in just open talk talking about this kind of stuff? Because there is one, and that was Truman's air aide, the guy who was sort of the head of Air Force One before they called it Air Force One. It was his aide to the Air Force, was brought in, and he tells a story that he had seen UFOs. He was at the 8th Air Force in Hawaii during World War II, and that they had these Foo Fighter, like things appearing on radar that they had seen. And he talks about when he got to the White House, he was called into the White House by Truman, and Truman says, I want you to go to the CIA, and I want you to gather all the stuff from the CIA, and I want you to brief me orally, not in writing, but orally, on what's going on with this flying saucer thing. And according to Landry, General Landry, he said he briefed the president every 3 months. And we figured out from February of 48, when he took over, to the end, he probably had 16, 17 briefings on UFOs. But Landry talks openly about it, so why wouldn't people in the Clinton administration or the Johnson administration talk about, Johnson was interested in UFOs and this happened, that happened, and it doesn't, which means it really, unless they're very secretive, it really didn't get talked about. It's not an issue, and that's the problem with this situation with Barack Obama. They're so busy, people don't realize how busy the president is. He's up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and it's like photo op, and then it's make these phone calls to push for a bill to get this across, and then you got a cabinet meeting, and then you've got this, and then you've got that, and it's like it's minute by minute the presidential record that they go through. They haven't got time, and this is why the briefing is so important. They don't have time to read anything. They're briefed by people. Someone will come in and they know there's a question coming on a certain subject. They'll go and give a 15-minute briefing to bring the president up to speed because he hasn't got time to do anything. So it's a very sort of interesting place to research, to see, and to see that that the records are important if we get a lead. For example, the famous story that I talked to Dick Cheney, that was in the Bush administration, where they had claimed that they were going to release the UFO files. Charles Huffer, who was a researcher, had been told by Bush on a number of occasions, yes, I'm going to release the UFO files. Here's Dick Cheney, he's Secretary of Defense, he knows, he's a smart guy. And then he said it'll be the first thing Cheney does when he gets to the White House. So of course when he got to the White House, nothing happened. Then a couple months later, he was on the Diana Rehm show, a Washington talk show that sometimes has high-ranking people. Hillary Clinton's been on there. All these people have been on there, and I decided I'm going to phone in. And I actually got on, I was the first caller on, and I said, Mr. Cheney, in all your jobs in government, have you ever been briefed on the subject of UFOs? And if so, when was it, and what were you told? And there was sort of a pause, and Cheney said, if I'd been briefed on that subject, it would probably be classified, and I wouldn't be talking about it. And he'd been caught off guard because nobody ever asked him the question. And so what happened was then Diana Rehm came, but by then he'd sort of caught his footing. She said, well, Mr. Vice President, have you had any UFO meetings since you got to the White House? And he said, no, I've had no UFO meetings since I got to the White House. So he'd sort of caught himself, and in the end, then he got a bunch of Halliburton questions, and he was furious at the end of the interview. He said, well, you got some real wild callers today. He was not happy about what he had gotten, and I don't think he really appeared on a talk show for years after that. He was so upset, and that to me is the critical thing, is if a person gets a high-ranking official, whether it's a 4-star general like David Rudiak talked to, or whether it's a vice president or a president, you don't want to ask them, what do you think about UFOs? You don't want to ask them, did they see a UFO? You only want to ask them one question. Were you briefed? When were you briefed? And what were you told? Because the briefing is the official thing that we're all looking for. If you're the president of the United States, the most powerful guy, if they know there's a question on UFOs coming, they're going to sit the president down and they're going to say, they're going to bring in the top intelligence people. They're going to gather all the best information they have on the subject. They're going to bring that people into the room, that guy into the room, and he's going to say, Mr. President, here's what we know about UFOs. And that's what you want. That's the only truth. The rest is all disinformation. What you want is what they're telling the president, unless they're lying to the president, which is another possibility. Speaking of Paul Hellyer, there's a very interesting story, and this ties in with the Wilbur Smith research. And this is, we knew about Paul Hellyer years ago. We were bugging him about UFOs long before he became public. And the two people that were bugging him was Arthur Bray. He was a researcher in Ottawa, Canada, and he was the guy who got control of the Smith files. They were trying to hide the Smith files, and they gave it to him. And he was a guy who had he was a Navy guy, had a security clearance. So some of the stuff that was in the files, he had already seen the top secret memo before it was declassified, because Smith had double copied it and it was in the files. So he knew about this. And anyway, Arthur Bray and I were after a story that happened in 1967. Canada, in 1967, was the 100th anniversary of the country. So they had a bunch of centennial projects all over the country, and one of the projects that they had was in St. Paul, Alberta, which is just outside of Edmonton, Alberta. They built a UFO landing base, a little tourist thing outside, maybe 100 feet across, and for the tourists to come, and they built this landing base. Now, Paul Hellyer at the time was Secretary of Defense in Canada. So he goes to this landing base to open the landing base, and he's making his speech, and he gives the speech, and he says, this is not the first time we've had a landing base. The Canadians opened up a top secret base in 1954 for UFOs to land, and nothing landed, therefore UFOs don't exist. So that's fine, and it was across the headlines or whatever. I didn't see the story till the 1970s, and suddenly I saw this story when I was working on the Wilbur Smith thing, because I really didn't get involved till 1975. I had no interest in UFOs whatsoever, never even thought about UFOs before then. And so when I saw this story, we started trying to contact Paul Hellyer, and we weren't really interested in much except, where did this story come from? And about this landing base that they had built. So when I went and I interviewed Wilbur Smith's wife, and this is about a week before she retired. She was very upset in the Canadian government because we have the French-English problem, and she was English, and the French were starting to take over the government. You had to be able to speak both languages, and she was very upset about a lot of things in the government. So she was ready to talk, and she told me all these different stories about Wilbur and about what was going on, and just stuff that would just blow you away. So and one of the stories, so then I gave her the newspaper heading from my 1967 from the Winnipeg Free Press, and I showed her this story, and it said, UFO base opened, whatever it was, for UFOs to land. And I handed it to her, and I said, did Wilbur have anything to do with this? So she sat there, and she read the story, and she said, yeah, that was Wilbur. And I said, so what happened? She says, well, Wilbur went to the Prime Minister of Canada, and he went to the RCMP, which is the Federal Police Force, and he went to the Secretary of the Defense Department, and he said, and Wilbur openly in his speeches talks about this, we got to quit trying to shoot these things down. And if we would shoot them down, we could have contact with them. And so he'd gone to these 3 different people, and he'd said, if you don't shoot down the UFO, I will get Alpha, which is the name of the alien, to land. So they went into a meeting, and they said, and you can't do anything to him. So they went into this meeting, and the 3 people agreed, yes, they would allow him to land without shooting him down. So then Wilbur said they wanted a guarantee that once whoever was going to talk to him, and that the base was Suffield, Alberta, which is the Area 51 of Canada. They'd done, it's got a restricted fly zone over it. It's a highly top secret base in Alberta. And so Wilbur wanted to guarantee that when the UFO landed at Suffield, that they would talk to it, do whatever they wanted, and then it would be allowed to take off. And they went back, and I can't remember exactly which one of the 3 agencies didn't agree that they would go along with that they would necessarily let the thing take off again. And so Wilbur says, okay, that's it, we're calling it off, nobody's going to land. So the whole story was told that it's true, Hellyer had this story from somewhere. So we went after Hellyer, and we said, so where'd the story come from? Where'd you get the story? Because we knew the inside story of what had happened. And Hellyer said, well, there was an expert inside the Department of Defense that told me the story, but I can't remember the guy's name. And I think this is maybe what got me in trouble with Hellyer. And I went, this doesn't make any sense. How can you not remember the top official in your department? And he said there was a file. The guy had the file. So when Hellyer retired, he said that he was going to go to the archives in Ottawa, and he was going to try to find this file. then he came back and said, no, he couldn't find the file. It wasn't there or whatever. But Bray and I, for years, were writing letters to Hellier, trying to get him to, who was the guy who told you the story? Where'd you get it? So this goes back to last year at the X conference. And I guess I put on my website that, you know, how can you believe this story that Hellier didn't remember who this was? So I remember Hellier, and he's a big guy. You've met him. He's a fairly impressive, large guy. He wanted to have breakfast. So I said, okay, fine. So we come down. He's got these files under his arm. And so he says to me, you know, Mr. Cameron, I may mean many things, but one of them is I'm not a liar. And I went, oh. And I'm immediately thinking, like, what the heck did I write, you know? So we sat down, and he plops these files open to me. And they're from 1967, and they're from the National Research Council and stuff. And I said, wow, this is 67. I mean, we've got all this stuff. This is, you know, this is nothing unusual. I mean, it's not the stuff. The thing I was interested in was your speech in 1967, where you talked about the fact they'd opened a UFO base to land. And we've got the other side of the story, and we wanted to know who the official was and what this is all about. And he says, I don't even remember giving the speech. It was written for me by somebody. I don't remember giving the speech. And after that conversation with Hellier, and we had breakfast for maybe 25 minutes, I was thoroughly convinced that he was absolutely telling the truth, that he really didn't remember, that he really didn't have any knowledge. And that's one of the things about Hellier, that he really didn't have any knowledge. There was maybe stuff coming across his desk, UFO sightings or whatever, but it was something that he just pushed aside. So here's a Secretary of Defense who really is out of the loop as well in Canada. And the stuff is going somewhere. But here's a guy who had the chance, and if he had the interest he had now, he would have got something done. But at that time, he really didn't have any interest. But it was very impressive to have this vision that some government official is covering up, and then to actually sit down with that government official for half an hour and go, I was wrong. The guy really doesn't remember, didn't really know.